January 8, 1942. Minus 37 degrees Celsius. The cold doesn't bite anymore at this temperature. It crushes. It invades your lungs like broken glass with every breath, turns your fingers into wooden sticks that refuse to obey, transforms your eyelashes into brittle wires of frost that crack when you blink. I am Gefreiter Hans Roth, 2nd Company, 290th Infantry Division, and I am standing in what the officers call a defensive position, but what we know is actually a frozen grave we haven't died in yet. The village behind us, if you can call it that, is called Demyansk, a collection of wooden structures that existed on no map we carried when we crossed the Soviet border 7 months ago. Back then, in June, we were conquerors. The photographs don't lie about that part. You can see it in our faces. Young men from Munich and Hamburg and Berlin, smiling as we rolled past burning Soviet tanks, as columns of prisoners stretched to the horizon, as Stalin's empire crumbled before the Wehrmacht's precision. We believed the war would be over by Christmas. We believed a lot of things. The snow started falling in October. Not the gentle Christmas snow of German winters, but Siberian snow that falls like it has weight, like it carries malice. By November, the temperatures had dropped below -20, and we learned that cold is an enemy more patient and more cruel than any soldier. It waits. It finds the gaps in your uniform, the moisture in your breath, the weakness in your will, and then it takes you, piece by piece. Demyansk itself means nothing. A railway junction, a few roads converging in the endless white emptiness of the Valdai Hills, 200 kilometers south of Leningrad. But in the grand strategy of Army Group North, it became everything. The town sat at the south anchor of our lines, a salient that pushed deep into Soviet territory like a fist thrust into cotton. Through Demyansk flowed our supplies, our reinforcements, our connection to the rest of the German army. Lose Demyansk, and 95,000 German soldiers would be cut off, surrounded, abandoned in the Russian winter. The Soviets knew this as well as we did. The first attacks came on January 7th, not with the usual artillery barrage we'd learned to expect, but with silence. A silence so complete it made your ears ring. We stood in our positions, frost forming on our rifle barrels, watching the white expanse that separated us from the forest line 800 meters away. Nobody spoke. Speaking meant exposing your face to the wind, and the wind at -37 could freeze exposed skin in under 2 minutes. Then they came. Not in neat parade formations like our training manuals showed, but in waves of white-clad figures that seemed to materialize from the snow itself. Soviet infantry in their padded jackets and felt boots, weapons that still functioned in cold that turned our machine gun oil to syrup, moving with the confidence of men who knew this land, this winter, this suffering. Oberfeldwebel Dietrich, our company sergeant, a veteran of Poland and France, who'd survived things that turned other men into trembling wrecks, grabbed the machine gunner next to me and screamed something I couldn't hear over the sudden eruption of gunfire. The MG-34 chattered for 3 seconds before the boat froze solid. The gunner, Möller, a baker's son from Cologne, stared at the weapon in disbelief, then terror. Without that machine gun, our section of line had no teeth. The Soviets closed the distance with terrifying speed. 500 meters, 400 meters. Their own weapons, simple and brutal, functioned perfectly. The distinctive crack of Mosin Magnon rifles, the mechanical chatter of PPSH submachine guns, the thump of mortars that sent shells arcing overhead to explode behind our positions, cutting off retreat. I fired my Kar 98K rifle, working the bolt with fingers I could barely feel, watching the brass cartridges tumble into the snow. Each shot was a guess. You couldn't aim properly with 3 layers of clothing, with hands shaking from cold rather than fear, with frost forming on your rifle sights. You pointed in the general direction of the enemy and prayed.
They overran our forward positions in 20 minutes, not because we didn't fight, but because the cold had already half defeated us before the first shot was fired. Men with frostbite couldn't pull triggers. Machine guns with frozen mechanisms became expensive clubs. Artillery pieces with hydraulic fluid turned to gel couldn't elevate their barrels. The Wehrmacht, that magnificent machine that had conquered Poland in weeks and France in months, was being defeated by temperature. We fell back to the village, a fighting retreat that left a trail of bodies in the snow. Some were dead from enemy fire. Others had simply stopped moving, surrendered to the cold, lay down in the snow and let the ice take them. There's a certain peace in freezing to death, they say. After the pain, after the confusion, comes warmth and sleep. I saw it in their faces as we passed them. They looked almost content. Demyansk itself was chaos. The division headquarters had established itself in the largest building, a former Communist Party office that still had a functioning stove. Outside, thousands of soldiers crowded into every structure that offered shelter from the wind. Horses, those that hadn't already been slaughtered for meat or died from cold, stood in courtyards with icicles hanging from their nostrils. Vehicles that had carried us across a continent sat frozen solid, their engines cracked from ice, their tires shattered like glass. The encirclement closed completely on January 8th. Soviet forces, fresh divisions transferred from the Siberian frontier, men who'd trained their entire lives for winter warfare, linked up east and west of Demyansk. The pocket was sealed. 95,000 German soldiers, elements of 6 divisions, surrounded in an area roughly 40 kilometers across. No relief force was coming. The nearest German units were over 100 kilometers away, themselves barely holding against Soviet winter offensives. We were alone. Generalleutnant von Sedlich-Kurzbach, commanding the pocket, assembled the officers on January 9th. I wasn't present, but word spread through the ranks with the speed that only truly terrible news can travel. The general had been blunt. We had supplies for perhaps 2 weeks if Russian severely, ammunition for another week of heavy fighting. Medical supplies were already critically low, and every day dozens of men were being lost to frostbite, exposure, and disease. Our only hope was the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe. At that moment, those words seemed like fantasy. The notion that aircraft could supply an entire surrounded army corps through Russian winter storms, through Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire, through weather that grounded even the hardiest crews, seemed impossible. Yet it was our only hope. The first Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft appeared on January 11th, lumbering through low clouds like pregnant geese, their 3 radial engines leaving contrails in the frozen air. Soviet fighters had already found them. We watched from our positions as a Ju-52 trailing smoke and flame struggled to reach the airfield, watching as its crew fought to control the dying aircraft, watching as it struck the ground and cartwheeled across the frozen runway in a ball of orange fire.
No one survived. But others got through. The transports landed, disgorged their precious cargo of ammunition, medical supplies, and food, then loaded wounded men for the return flight. Men with limbs black from frostbite, with 1,000-yard stares from too many days under bombardment, with wounds that had frozen solid in the cold and would only begin bleeding when they reached warmth. If they reached warmth. The supply situation was carefully calculated desperation. Each Junkers Yo-52 could carry roughly 2 tons of cargo. The Pocket required a minimum of 300 tons per day to sustain combat operations. This meant 150 aircraft flights daily in winter weather through Soviet air defenses to primitive airfields that were under constant artillery bombardment. The mathematics of our survival were written in the sky, and the numbers didn't look promising. By mid-January, we learned to live underground, not in proper bunkers, but in holes scraped into the frozen earth, covered with whatever we could find: logs from demolished buildings, sheets of corrugated metal, blankets stiff with ice. Inside these hovels, 6 or 8 men would huddle together for warmth, breathing the same fetid air, sharing body heat like animals. The lucky positions had small stoves improvised from oil drums. The unlucky positions had nothing but each other.
The cold became our world, our obsession, our constant companion. Every action, every decision was filtered through the question of warmth. Do you eat the frozen bread now and gain immediate calories, or save it for later when you might be colder? Do you keep your gloves on and fumble with your rifle, or remove them for dexterity and risk frostbite? Do you sleep and risk never waking up, or stay awake and burn precious energy? Food became a memory of civilization. The official ration, when it arrived, was 300 grams of bread per day, a thin soup made from God knows what, occasionally a bit of horse meat from animals that had frozen to death. 300 grams is roughly 2 slices of bread. That's what the German army considered sufficient to sustain combat soldiers in Arctic conditions. We learned to supplement: bark from trees, boiled until soft, snow melted for water that never quite felt clean. Anything we could scavenge from Soviet positions during the brief periods when we counterattacked. The Soviet attacks never stopped. They came in the darkness before dawn, when our sentries were at their weakest, when the cold had sapped what little strength sleep provided. They came in blizzards, using the wind and snow as cover. They came with T-34 tanks that somehow still functioned in temperatures that killed our panthers and tigers, their wide tracks distributing weight across snow that swallowed our vehicles to their chassis. February brought a new dimension of suffering: the wounded. In normal warfare, in civilized warfare, if such a thing exists, wounded men received morphine, bandages, evacuation to field hospitals. In Demynask, wounded men received a field dressing if supplies allowed, perhaps a shot of vodka scavenged from Soviet dead, and a space on the floor of whatever building served as an aid station. There, they waited for death or for one of the UJ-52s. The aid station in our sector occupied a cellar beneath what had been a schoolhouse. The building above had been destroyed by Soviet artillery, but the cellar remained intact. A concrete cave packed with broken men. I entered it once, carrying a corporal who'd taken shrapnel in both legs. The smell hit me first. Gangrene, unwashed bodies, feces, blood, disinfectant. Then the sounds: moaning, crying, occasionally screaming when the orderlies had to operate without anesthetic. The medical staff, overwhelmed and undersupplied, did what they could. Amputations without proper anesthetic, sutures with thread scavenged from parachutes, bandages reused until they fell apart. The corporal I carried died 3 days later, not from his wounds, but from cold. The cellar had no heat. His body temperature simply dropped until his heart stopped. They stacked him with the others outside, frozen solid, to be buried when and if the ground ever thawed. Soviet propaganda shells began falling in late February, not high explosive, but canisters that burst open to scatter leaflets across our positions. The messages were printed in German, offering food, warmth, and safety to any soldier who surrendered. They promised heated barracks, full rations, medical care. Some men believed it. They slipped away during the night, stumbling toward Soviet lines with their hands raised. We never saw them again. Whether they found the promised warmth or found a bullet, we never knew. The Luftwaffe's supply operation became legendary even as we lived through it. The transports flew in all weather through conditions that should have grounded them, piloted by men who understood that their cargo meant the difference between survival and death for 95,000 soldiers. They landed on runways grated by artillery, under fire from Soviet guns positioned just beyond the perimeter, engines running as they unloaded because shutting down meant never restarting in the cold. But it wasn't enough. It could never be enough. The mathematics were inescapable. We needed 300 tons daily. The Luftwaffe delivered on their best days 200 tons. On bad weather days, 50. On the worst days, nothing. The deficit accumulated like debt. Ammunition stocks dwindled. Food rations shrank. Medical supplies vanished. The pocket was slowly bleeding out. March brought a brief false hope. Temperatures rose to -10, which felt almost tropical after months of deeper cold. The snow softened, movement became easier. Then it rained. In March in Russia, it rained freezing rain that coated everything in ice. Our positions became skating rinks, trenches filled with water that froze overnight, trapping men's boots in solid ice. The airfield became unusable for 3 days, and in those 3 days we came within hours of collapse. The Soviet breakthrough almost succeeded on March 15th. A massive assault, coordinated across multiple sectors, backed by artillery that had been stockpiled for weeks. They punched through our lines in 2 places, advanced nearly 3 kilometers before desperate counterattacks, led by men who could barely walk, somehow sealed the breaches. We held, barely. The cost was appalling. 2nd Company, my company, had entered Demyansk with 140 men. By mid-March, we numbered 38 effective soldiers. The rest were dead, wounded beyond return, or had simply disappeared into the white emptiness. Other companies had suffered similarly. Entire battalions existed only on paper, their actual strength measured in dozens rather than hundreds. Yet we held. Day after day, week after week, we held. Not through superior tactics or brilliant leadership, but through sheer stubborn refusal to die. The German army, whatever its crimes, whatever its causes, produced soldiers who simply would not quit. Men who should have broken kept fighting. Men who should have surrendered kept resisting. Perhaps it was discipline, perhaps it was fear of Soviet captivity, perhaps it was simply that enduring became habit, and habits are hard to break. the relief operation finally came in late April. Operation Bridge Building, they called it. Fresh divisions pulled from quieter sectors, smashing eastward to re-establish land contact with the pocket. We heard them before we saw them, the rumble of artillery barrages that walked steadily closer day by day, the distinctive crack of German 88mm guns, the heavier thump of 150mm howitzers, the sound of the Wehrmacht at full strength rather than the hollow shell we had become. The corridor opened on April 21, 1942. A narrow salient, barely 5 kilometers wide, under constant Soviet fire, but open. Land contact restored. The siege of Demyansk was broken. They began evacuating the wounded immediately. Long columns of trucks, fighting through mud that had replaced snow, carrying broken men toward field hospitals in the rear. The dead we left behind. Over 20,000 graves in the frozen earth around Demyansk, marked with simple wooden crosses or sometimes nothing at all. 20,000 German soldiers who'd survived Poland, France, and the invasion of Russia, only to die of cold and hunger in a village that meant nothing. I walked out of Demyansk on April 23rd, part of the bedraggled column of survivors stumbling toward the corridor. We had been ordered to hold the pocket for 96 days. We'd held it for 103. The division that marched out bore little resemblance to the division that had been trapped. We moved slowly, painfully. Men with frostbite, stumps where toes had been, with fingers missing, with eyes that had seen too much suffering to ever fully focus again. Behind us, the Luftwaffe had flown 24,000 sorties into Demyansk, delivered 15,000 tons of supplies, evacuated 20,000 wounded. They'd lost 262 aircraft and over 350 aircrew. The mathematics of our survival had been paid in full, in blood and fire and the bodies of pilots who'd flown one mission too many. The strategic situation we'd preserved was already irrelevant. The Soviet spring offensives had failed to destroy us, but they had achieved something more important. They'd proven the Red Army could fight, could coordinate complex operations, could make the Wehrmacht bleed. The myth of German invincibility, already cracked at Moscow, had shattered completely in the frozen hell of Demyansk.
I was sent to a field hospital near Pskov, where doctors examined the wreckage of my body with professional detachment. Frostbite in 7 toes, 3 fingers on my left hand showing early signs of gangrene, malnutrition severe enough to require intravenous feeding, exposure damage to my lungs that would plague me for the rest of my life. The examining physician marked me for evacuation to Germany, unfit for frontline service. In the hospital train carrying us westward, away from Russia, away from the cold, I lay in my bunk and tried to process what we'd endured. 103 days in temperatures that reached -45°C, 103 days of constant combat against an enemy that had every advantage, 103 days of slow starvation, of watching friends freeze solid in their sleep, of scraping existence from the frozen earth one miserable hour at a time. The man in the bunk next to me, a sergeant from a different division, asked what Demyansk had been like. I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it again. How do you explain hell to someone who hasn't been there? How do you describe cold so intense it burns, hunger so deep you dream about bread, fear so constant it becomes normalcy? You can't. Words are insufficient. War resists language. But I tried. I'd told him about the cold first, because the cold was everything. I told him how it invaded your body slowly, how you'd wake up and realize you couldn't feel your feet, and you'd try to massage them back to life, but your hands were too numb to grasp anything. I told him about watching the thermometer drop past -40 and knowing that every breath you took outside was burning your lungs, causing damage that wouldn't heal. I told him about the hunger. Real hunger, not missing lunch hunger, but the kind of hunger that consumes you from within, that makes your body eat its own muscle for fuel, that turns your thoughts into obsessive loops about food. I told him about dreaming in such vivid detail about my mother's cooking that I'd wake up tasting phantom food, my stomach cramping with disappointment. I'd told him about the fear, which wasn't the sharp terror of combat, but the slow dread of entropy, the fear that your body was shutting down one system at a time, the fear that the next supply flight wouldn't arrive, the fear that you'd fall asleep and simply not wake up, that the cold would take you gently into nothing, the fear that even if you survived, you'd never be warm again, never be full again, never be whole again. He listened in silence, and when I finished, he said nothing for a long moment. Then he asked the only question that mattered. Was it worth it? I had no answer then. I have no answer now, decades later, with the war long finished and the Reich destroyed and the price of our ambitions counted in millions of dead. Was holding Demyansk worth 20,000 German lives, worth the frostbite and starvation and psychological damage inflicted on those who survived? Worth the Luftwaffe crews who flew into Soviet fire day after day? Worth anything at all? The strategic answer is ambiguous. Demyansk tied down Soviet forces that might have been used elsewhere. It demonstrated the Luftwaffe's capacity for aerial supply, a lesson that would be catastrophically misapplied at Stalingrad 9 months later. It maintained German control of the Valdai Hills for another year. But these are abstractions, staff officer concerns, explanations that mean nothing to the men who endured. The human answer is simpler and more terrible. It was worth it because we had no choice. We held because we were ordered to hold, because surrender meant Soviet captivity, because retreat meant abandoning wounded comrades, because leaving our positions meant admitting that all the suffering had been meaningless. We held because men will endure almost anything rather than admit defeat. The train carried us westward through Poland, through Germany, towards hospitals and recovery, and eventually returned to civilian life for the lucky ones, or returned to combat for the unlucky. I watched the countryside past, real countryside, with trees and farms and villages that weren't destroyed, and felt profoundly disconnected from everything. The world had continued while we'd been frozen in place, dying slowly in a pocket of hell that the rest of humanity knew nothing about.
In Germany, people went about their lives. They worried about rations and bombing raids and letters from the front. But they didn't know, couldn't know, what it meant to choose between firing your rifle or freezing your fingers off. They couldn't imagine eating bark and calling it dinner. They couldn't comprehend cold so deep it stopped time, trapped you in eternal suffering, made death seem preferable to one more day of endurance. I was 23 years old when I entered Demyansk. I emerged an old man in a young body, aged by suffering that left no visible scars but marked me permanently. The frostbite I could manage, the missing toes were an inconvenience, but the cold stayed with me, a phantom sensation that no amount of warmth could fully dispel. Decades later, in the heat of summer, I would sometimes shiver uncontrollably, my body remembering temperatures that should have killed me. The nightmares were worse, not dreams of combat, but dreams of cold. Dreams where I was back in the frozen trench, unable to move, unable to feel my extremities, watching ice crystals form on my eyelashes. Dreams where the supply planes never came, where we slowly starved and froze in equal measure, where the Soviets closed in and there was nowhere to retreat. I'd wake up gasping, convinced I could see my breath despite the heated room, convinced the cold had finally returned to claim me. The official history of Demyansk speaks of strategic necessity, of operational flexibility, of the successful employment of aerial resupply. It uses terms like defensive operations and calculated risk and acceptable losses. It reduces 103 days of suffering to a paragraph in staff studies, a footnote in the larger narrative of the Eastern Front. But for those who were there, Demyansk was something beyond military operations. It was revelation. Revelation of how much the human body can endure before breaking. Revelation of how arbitrary survival becomes in extreme conditions. How death selects randomly among the equally brave, equally strong, equally determined. Revelation that courage and discipline and training, all the qualities the army prizes, mean nothing when measured against -45 degrees and empty stomachs. I survived Demyansk through no virtue of my own. Better men died, braver men froze, stronger men simply gave up and let the cold take them. I survived through mathematical chance, through being in slightly less exposed positions, through happening to be present when rations were distributed, through random fortune that has no meaning or justice or logic. The survivor's guilt settled on me like snow, accumulated over the years, never quite melting. After the war, after Germany's surrender and the long reckoning with what we had done and what had been done to us, a few Demyansk survivors would occasionally gather. We didn't talk about the war much. We didn't need to. We'd sit in quiet rooms, drinking coffee or beer, and someone would mention the cold. Just that word, and we'd all nod. The cold. The ultimate enemy, more effective than Soviet firepower, more deadly than any weapon, more cruel than any human malice. One of these survivors, Muller, the machine gunner, whose weapon had frozen solid in the first attack, told me years later that he'd never felt warm again, not truly warm. Even in the August heat, even beside roaring fires, even under mountains of blankets, he felt a core coldness that never left. His wife thought he was exaggerating, but I understood. The cold from Demyansk had burned itself into us, branded us, marked us as survivors of something that should have killed us. The Soviets never forgot Demyansk either. For them, it represented a failure to destroy a surrounded German force, a lesson learned the hard way about the necessity of completing encirclements. They'd had us trapped, outnumbered, outgunned,
fighting in conditions that should have guaranteed our destruction. Yet we held, sustained by nothing but aerial supply and desperate stubbornness. When they surrounded the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad 9 months later, they'd learned their lesson. No relief corridor opened, no Luftwaffe supply effort succeeded. The pocket was crushed completely.
I sometimes wonder if the soldiers trapped in Stalingrad knew about Demyansk, if they drew hope from our survival, believing that encirclement wasn't necessarily death, if they waited for the relief that never came, for the supply planes that couldn't deliver enough, for the miracle that had saved 95,000 men in the frozen Valdai Hills. I wonder if they cursed us, if our survival had given false hope that led to their destruction. The mathematics of war are unforgiving. Demyansk required 300 tons of supplies daily and received perhaps 150. The deficit accumulated slowly enough that we survived. Stalingrad required 700 tons daily and received less than 100. The deficit accumulated too quickly, and 250,000 men died or entered Soviet captivity from which few returned. The difference between survival and annihilation measured in tons of supplies and the capacity of transport aircraft. History records Demyansk as a successful German defensive operation, a demonstration of Wehrmacht's resilience and Luftwaffe capability. The truth is messier and more horrifying. We were defeated men holding untenable positions through nothing but refusal to accept reality. The Luftwaffe performed miracles daily just to keep us alive at minimum subsistence level. We won nothing except the right to continue suffering, to hold ground that would be abandoned anyway when the strategic situation changed. But we survived. That matters, even if history finds no grand meaning in it. 95,000 men entered the Demyansk Pocket. 75,000 walked out, damaged but breathing. 20,000 remained behind, their bodies buried in frozen Russian earth, their names eventually lost even to memory. The difference between these groups was luck, nothing more nor less. Luck in positioning, luck in timing, luck in being missed by Soviet bullets and shells and cold. I am an old man now, decades removed from that frozen hell. The missing toes are an old story. The lung damage from exposure killed me slowly across years rather than quickly across days. The nightmares have faded to occasional unwelcome visitors rather than nightly torments. But the memory remains sharp and painful and impossible to communicate. When people ask about the war, I tell them I was on the Eastern Front, and they nod with vague understanding. They've read histories, seen films, heard stories. They think they understand, but they don't. They can't. Understanding requires experience, and experience of that magnitude is not transferable through words or images or second-hand accounts. The frozen hell of Demyansk was real. 103 days when survival was measured hour by hour, when warmth was memory and food was fantasy, and tomorrow was uncertainty. 103 days that transformed young soldiers into broken survivors, that killed 20,000 and damaged 75,000 more. That proved both human resilience and human fragility in equal measure. I survived it. That is all. I claim no heroism, no glory, no pride in endurance. I survived because others died, because the Luftwaffe flew impossible missions, because the mathematics of destruction were fractionally less efficient than the mathematics of supply. I survived to carry the memory, to bear witness, to stand as living proof of what men endured in service to causes they didn't choose and strategies they didn't understand. The cold never leaves you. Even now, in comfort and safety and warmth, I remember the wind that cut through every layer of clothing, the ice that formed inside our shelters, the crystalline sky above frozen battlefields, the sound of supply planes that meant one more day of life, the silence when they didn't come, the cold, always the cold.